In the recent TWA, Bungie announced that cross-save is launching on August 21st, and that date is coming a lot sooner than expected. At the point of recording this video, that's just shy of 2 weeks away. I imagine many of you right now that are anticipating making a switch to PC already do have your PCs or are getting your PCs and getting on Destiny 2 for some of the first time on PC. I wanted to make a video on everything I can offer about playing Destiny 2 on PC with a controller and making that transition from console to PC. Although it's still controller, there are some settings that you might need to tweak to make sure it feels best for you. So speaking of settings, let's start with that. So initially when I swapped to PC and decided to continue playing controller for the long run, I was originally at 4 sensitivity, pretty much the same as what I played on console. I realized if I was going to attempt to play controller for the long run and compete, or attempt to compete with some pretty stellar M&K players, this wasn't going to work, and I'd need to be able to turn or react quicker to their movements, and so this led me to swapping and forcing myself to play on a much higher sensitivity, eventually playing at 10 sensitivity. For myself, I immediately forced myself to go straight to 10, although moving up sens gradually might be more suitable for you. I wasn't so great at the start, but as time went on, I adjusted much better to it. Once I was more comfortable with controlling 10 sens or being able to maneuver around 10 sensitivity, I settled on 9 sensitivity to have something that felt a bit steadier from what I made myself used to. However, this is also where FOV enters the discussion. Console FOV, or field of view, is 72 for reference. And for myself, I wasn't someone who immediately went to the max FOV, so 105 field of view, as it felt like targets were rather small. There was a bit of a fisheye, I believe the effect is called, and sensitivity was a bit fast in comparison. Originally, I went to 90 field of view, but settled on 95 for the majority of my time playing Destiny 2 on PC. I felt like this was a decent middle ground between console's FOVs and PC's maximum FOV, and it felt like my sense was steady, targets were visible, weapon recoil wasn't too jarring and still better than console, and my muscle memory felt right with this. 9 sensitivity and 95 FOV were my standard settings for a long while, the majority of the time playing D2 on PC with a controller. These were my main settings that I stuck with, and as much as this is a preference thing and I encourage you to try different things, this worked and felt best for me for a long while. Recently, I wanted to change my settings to feel, emphasis on feel, as though flinch or recoil was less jarring, so I tried 100 FOV and 9 sens, so this was 5 FOV greater, same sensitivity, and for a week straight, for whatever reason, I could not hit a single snipe. Something about my muscle memory didn't agree with this FOV or sense combination. I've heard on D2PC, and this was from a thread that was out closer to release talking about sniper scopes and FOV, that field of view affects your zoom, especially on snipers, and therefore affects your muscle memory. And I do believe this, as I think I experienced it firsthand with my attempts here to change my settings. Later on, I then tried 105 field of view, and it definitely felt better for whatever reason and agreed with my muscle memory more. But 9 sens still felt a bit shaky at times and could have been a bit better, so recently I turned my sensitivity down 1 step to 8 to make it a bit steadier for the new FOV. And I don't think my aim has ever felt better, to be honest. Button layout is the next logical setting to talk about, and I think this really comes down to pure preference. For reference, I use bumper jumper simply because this is what I've used since back in the Halo days, and I do not use controller vibration. I do not think you should use it. I don't recommend it, as for me, it heavily distracts me while I'm trying to shoot at a target. I do use an Elite controller, and I would recommend investing in something like this, in one of these paddle style controllers that give you accessibility to buttons on the rear so that you don't have to be moving your thumbs off of the thumbstick so much. So the idea behind my button layout is to have as many important actions on buttons that are accessible without having to move my thumbs off of the thumbstick. So my jump is L1 or left bumper, grenade is R1 or right bumper, of course shooting and ADSing is going to be right trigger, left trigger, or R2, L2. Other important commands are my super is on the A button, or what would be on the PlayStation controller X button, which isn't used too often, so I don't really have to worry about it, and it's a single button press, which I really like. Crouching is on the B button or circle as it would be on the PS4 controller. However, I'm going to get back to that as that's a very important command, as well as reloading is on the X button on Xbox controller, square on PlayStation controller, and then swapping weapons is on triangle or Y. I use two paddles at the back of my Elite controller. I use these smaller paddles, and my left paddle is going to be for sprint, which I'll explain in a second. I know that's a weird kind of task considering it's mapped to the thumbstick already. And then on the right paddle I have crouch. So I mentioned earlier that crouch is normally on a face button and would have to make me play claw or move my thumbs off the thumbstick to use. Having that on a rear button or one of my back paddles allows me to crouch without moving my thumbs off the thumbstick and have that available in a gunfight while shooting. I've mapped sprint to the back left paddle simply because it's a little bit more relaxing. I came by a point in time where I was playing controller where it actually just hurt to keep clicking in and was kind of affecting my joints, so I didn't like continuously clicking into the stick and having to slide afterwards to do the sprint slide or a quick slide motion. With both the sprint on the back left and the crouch on the back right, I can do a quick slide whenever just by tapping left paddle, right paddle. So all my main commands and actions that I would need mid gunfight or need fluidly in and out of gunfights are pretty readily available without having to move my thumbs off the thumbsticks. And my paddle setup on the back of the controller allows me to have easy fluid movement with little to no effort to allow me to do quick slides, dodges, and crouches. I know this isn't exactly a setting, although I think it should be, and I don't think it should be a perk. I think traction is essential. If you're not used to it, I do recommend getting used to it, and having a tighter turn radius is so useful on controller, especially when going against MK players that can literally turn on a dime. I greatly recommend utilizing traction for an improved turn radius. Moving on to graphical settings, I generally have mostly everything set to low or turned off to prioritize the best performance and consistent frames as possible in the game at all times, and because I also think that it looks best while playing. It's very important to play with VSync off. Depending on your monitor, you might experience some screen tearing. My old BenQ 60Hz monitor did, which I used when playing console, and if so, I do recommend upgrading perhaps. I played the entire first year of Destiny 2 with VSync on, which compared to most other players would definitely have it off on PC, and coming from console, having a similar built-in type thing might not feel too bad to you, but it does create a degree of input delay. And without this enabled, I felt my aim and reactions become exponentially better, and my ability to make those small details, slight movements, was vastly improved. I have a 144Hz monitor currently, and my PC consistently pushes out an average of 130 to 140 FPS, and it's by no means a crazy top-of-the-line PC in my opinion, especially in terms of my graphics card, which is an NVIDIA GTX 1060 6GB, but as a result I have my frame cap set to 140 FPS. Reticle placement is another setting. Personally, I prefer PC crosshairs, which are centered in the dead center of the screen, as opposed to the console default crosshairs, which will position your weapons and your crosshair lower in your FOV to provide more vertical space in the FOV since controllers can't turn upwards as quickly. Personally, this doesn't really matter to me, and I don't find issues with looking up against players, and I prefer to have the PC default crosshairs in the dead center of the screen with my weapons positioned to such, as I very much dislike seeing my weapon models placed oddly lower than the center of the screen, and I prefer to focus on the dead center of my monitor when playing. So, quick TLDR of all the settings I've talked about. I encourage you to play at a higher sensitivity. My best settings were 95 FOV, 9 sensitivity, or 105 FOV, 8 sensitivity. I'd recommend investing in an Elite controller or some sort of paddle style controller if you really want to be the most competitive possible, and I'd utilize a button layout or setup with that gives you as many key functions available without having to move your thumbs off the thumbsticks for at least things that you need mid-gunfight and fluid movement. I very much recommend not using controller vibration at all. I think it's really, really bad for your shot. and I recommend using traction for a tighter turn radius. I play with VSync off and most graphic settings at low or off with a 140 FPS cap, but this changes based on your computer obviously. And finally, I prefer PC-centered crosshairs. A small tidbit for people that might be trying to adjust to a higher sensitivity for PC, I think many people will most likely be looking to play a higher sensitivity on PC with a controller. On console before D2 I played on 4 settings, but if I were to go back now I'd probably play on at least 6 or 7, while I currently play 8 or 9 on PC. A higher sensitivity on PC doesn't quite feel as fast as it does on console because the field of view is much wider. On console, that field of view is tighter and more zoomed in, so panning feels faster since the field of view is narrow, while on a PC, the higher sense doesn't feel as fast as you'll have more visibility in your field of view. The closer something is to you, the faster it seems to be moving, and as a result, with the narrow FOV on console, the same amount of movement on a lower FOV will not feel the same as on a wider FOV. For some though, it might still feel like quite a jump to a higher sensitivity and feel difficult to make some slight movements while aiming. In this case, I'd recommend gradually increasing your sensitivity in increments of 2 after becoming comfortable with the previous sensitivity, and focusing on utilizing the left stick, so character movement, to make slight movements and tracking, and the right stick for flicks and more drastic movements towards targets. Now, I also wanted to include and talk briefly about weapons. So from my time on Destiny 2 PC with a controller since release, these are my top picks for the best or most consistent primary weapons. I think there's other viable weapons, of course, on controller, but I think these ones have always stood out as really, really consistent. And if you're looking to pick up the game and need a starting point for a really consistent weapon to use, well, these could be some suggestions. I think the viable primary weapon performance and feeling changes more than other weapon types, from controller on console to controller on PC to M&K on PC, as opposed to something like specials like snipers or shotguns. All the best snipers are the same on controller and M&K, same with shotguns and other weapons. So a lot of these suggestions here are really just focused on primary weapons that feel really consistent. I know some of these might be a bit dependent on the right role, but I'll mention the highlights with them. Firstly, Antia PD, Antiope D, I don't know, however you want to say it, and Sondok C. These SMGs really don't realize and don't know that they're SMGs. They have roughly 27 to 28 meters range before experiencing any sort of damage drop off, which is crazy, and as a result have a pretty fast 1.7 second all body shot time to kill. Better yet, the year 1 version is actually available from your collections, as many know, with ricochet rounds and other range perks and kill clip, so it's nearly the best roll possible unless you got the same roll plus more in a year 2 version from the gunsmith. If you don't have the year 1 NTAP unlocked for whatever reason, doing the adventure Exodus Siege on Exodus Black on Nessus will get you the nearly exact same blue counterpart, the Sondok C. Not Forgotten and Lunasail don't need much explaining, but these hand cannons have the impact of a 150 RPM, but the consistency traits of the 180 RPM archetype. So it has the most consistent recoil and recoil patterns possible, and as a result, they don't really have that somewhat janky feeling that other hand cannons have on controller, so they're potentially the most competitive hand cannons on controller to use against M&K players. Ace of Spades and Austringer, god, I don't know how to pronounce this. These are, in my experience, the most consistent feeling hand cannons in the kinetic slot, mainly because range is such an incredibly important stat for hand cannons and their consistency on controller, and being able to compete with hand cannons on M&K, in my experience. Ace and Austringer, given the right role, have incredibly high range stats, with decently high aim assist values and recoil patterns to pair with them, which make them fantastic. Outbreak Prime, Vigilant Swing, Bygones, and Last Perdition. Yeah, that's a lot of pulses, I know. Outbreak Prime and Viewing are my picks for the most consistent feeling pulses on controller. Outbreak Prime has a fast rate of fire and lands headshots with ease, has nearly no recoil and pretty high range, not to mention it barely flinches at all in gunfights, which makes it again really consistent. V-Wing has low recoil and a low demand for headshots, either resulting in a potential 2-burst kill with all headshots, or at worst cases, slightly less than 3 bursts to the body to kill, which is a pretty good TTK. Bygones and Last Perdition are great standard legendary pulses that are of the adaptive archetype, which is my pick for the current best performing archetype overall for pulses, and each have access to powerful perk combinations and stat rolls, including high range, recoil consistency, kill clip, and more. So with the right roll, these feel pretty great. Attempting to keep the list here short and sweet, not to say that there aren't other viable weapons, but lastly, we have the last word, no pun intended. This gun needs no explanation. Thanks to the higher FOV on PC, the recoil feels less drastic and far more manageable. And as it inherently has the equivalent of an optimal TTK for most other hand cannons through only body shots within 20 to 22 meters, it's simply one of the most powerful weapons in the game. And as much as it might not be quite as strong as its potential with M&K, it's still insanely powerful. This video has gone far longer than anticipated already, so I'm not going to hold you guys any longer, but I hope the information was helpful for those of you transitioning with cross-save from console to PC and continue to want to play with controller, or for those of you that are just looking to refine your settings and looking for new suggestions. If you'd like to see more content like this, I do stream pretty much daily on Twitch, twitch.tv/Drewskys. Link is in the description. I appreciate you watching, and I will see you later. Take care.